way. Or
perfect.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's now officially start this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to this event co-organized by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, IPEN, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Children and Youth Major Group to the United Nations Environment Programme, and the Geneva Environment Network, ahead of the third session of the ad hoc open-ended working group on a science policy panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution prevention that is taking place in Geneva next week. And we have already many stakeholders who have arrived in Geneva and are attending meetings organized back-to-back to this negotiation. We are here because the United Nations Environment Assembly in 2022 made history by adopting a series of landmark resolutions, including the one that decided to convene the ad hoc open-ended working group. In the context of the triple planetary crisis that the Earth is facing of climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, as well as pollution, the aim of the United Nations Environment Assembly resolution that is bringing stakeholders to Geneva next week is to set up a science policy panel for the chemicals, waste, and pollution crisis and complement the two other panels we have for the climate change crisis, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as IPCC, and for the biodiversity loss crisis, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPBES. The working group set up throughout the resolution is expected to conclude its substantive discussions on proposals for the establishment of this science policy panel at the Geneva meeting next week. Today, we are launching a new information note prepared by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and are joined by leading experts to discuss why the panel must include safeguards to avoid the risks associated with the existence of conflicts of interest by creating an environment in which actual or perceived conflicts of interest are adequately disclosed and prevented. The event is also part of a series of events that the organizers have been holding in the margins of various chemicals and waste-related negotiations, and it builds on the landmark resolutions adopted at the General Assembly, at the United Nations Environment Assembly, at the International Labour Conference, at the Human Rights Council, and at the World Health Assembly. Before moving to the formal opening, I would like to remind that throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. The video and the summary of this event will be available as usual on the webpage of the event, and the link is being shared on the chat. Ana Paula Souza, who is leading on pollution-related issues at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, will moderate this event. And you will see her chairing the event after the welcoming remarks of Maria Eugenia Gonzalez Anaya, who is leading on environmental matters at the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the United Nations here in Geneva, and very active in numerous processes related to chemicals, waste, and pollution to this cluster here at the United Nations. So without further ado, Ms. Gonzalez, you have the floor.
Thank you, Diana, for that introduction. Excellencies, colleagues, it is an honor to share the next hour with such a distinguished panel. I would like to thank the co-organizers for the invitation to open this event to address one of the key issues that will be discussed during the third meeting of the open-ended working group to prepare proposals for a science policy panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, which is the presence of conflicts of interest in decision-making bodies. The unsound management of chemicals and waste poses a significant threat to fundamental human rights, including the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, access to safe food, water, and sanitation, as well as the right to health and a healthy work environment. Moreover, these challenges also have implications for equality and non-discrimination within societies, as well as multi- and transgenerational effects, including that the impacts on indigenous peoples who have preserved and sustainable use ecosystems for millennia are pronounced. Similarly, pollution takes on dangerous dimensions and disproportionate impacts to certain groups, aggravating existing inequalities, particularly among women, children, and frontline communities and workers at heightened risk of occupational exposure to toxics. That is why, in the context of ongoing negotiations for the Science Policy Panel, we urge for the panel to firmly root in a rights-based approach that reduces inequalities while protecting the environment. It is imperative that decision-making processes related to the protection of human health and the environment from hazardous substances is grounded in robust, independent scientific research and free from conflicts of interest. We are convinced that the effectiveness of Science Policy Panel will rely on its ability to be inclusive and integrate individuals and institutions from developing countries through its work, from deciding on its work program through the production of reports and assessments to the dissemination of its products. Developing countries are those who face the biggest challenges in terms of developing effective policies to tackle chemicals, waste, and pollution. Thus, they need to be an active part in the future panel. In this regard, to promote effective participation of developing nations from all regions and subregions, the panel will require robust and consistent capacity building activities. In that sense, it is very positive and promising that the SPP counts on a capacity building function. Transparency, integrity, and public participation are crucial principles that must guide these processes to ensure objectivity, reliability, and accountability. Safeguards to disclose and prevent conflicts of interest are essential to ensure trustworthiness in decision-making processes. Through collaborative efforts, we can work towards a more sustainable and equitable future for all, where human rights are respected and human health and the environment is protected for future generations. This is why, in our perspective, the Science Policy Panel should count on an interdisciplinary team of scientists, including experts from a diverse range of scientific fields, reflective of geographical and gender balance, as well as from different sources of knowledge, including indigenous knowledge, highlighting the importance of the commitment to human rights, independency, and robust regulatory responses. An efficient mechanism for identifying and managing conflicts of interest, particularly for experts involved in panel work, should integrate different components, such as the right to science in the context of toxic substances, the health perspective, ensure transparency, process to deal with information deemed commercially sensitive, appropriate monitoring, disclosure and management processes, indigenous knowledge on par with other types of science, and ensure its work is inclusive and participatory. These are some of the issues that will be addressed by the panelists in the next hour. I conclude my intervention here, thanking again the co-organizers for the efforts in promoting discussions on one of the most pressing global crises, pollution, which has direct impacts on human health and the enjoyment of human rights. Without further ado, I wish you fruitful discussions.
Thank you so much, Maria Eugenia. I'm used to call you Maru. But first, I wanted to start by thanking Diana and all the colleagues at the Geneva Environment Network for giving a platform to UN agencies in Geneva, amongst other actors, working with us to bring a range of issues that are critical to to environmental negotiations and process to such a wide and rich audience. Thank you very much, Diane and team. Thank you also, Maria Eugenia, for highlighting that the unsound management of chemicals and waste and pollution more broadly is a human rights issue, close linked to inequalities within and amongst countries. And thank you also for Mexico's commitment to advance human rights in all aspects of international governance, including related to environment. This is a reminder that all states have legally binding instruments. They cannot be selective, picked, and chosen. Well, the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications, that's the full name of the right to science, which we shorten to right to science, requires that policies be based on the best available, generally accepted scientific evidence. And there is a very simple reason for that. When science is compromised, it permeates decision-making with dire consequences for people and the planet. In this scenario, maximizing return on investment becomes more important than the respect of human rights. And we have seen this repeatedly. We've seen how the asbestos industry has blocked regulations through campaigns suggesting that asbestos is not toxic. We have seen companies that have produced highly hazardous pesticides that have pressured in order to avoid controls and bans. Companies that produce or market dangerous chemicals such as endocrine disrupting chemicals and forever chemicals that have diverted attention to avoid controls. How the plastic industries has delayed controls, including by spreading disinformation on the false promises of recycling, and how the fossil fuel industry has spread disinformation on climate change, resulting in delayed action on the parts of governments. The list does not stop here. Over the past decades, tobacco, pharmaceutical, petrochemical, and agricultural business, among many others, have worked to suppress research and analysis regarding the failure to respect human rights. Some of the tactics used include corporate influence on regulatory process, attacks on scientific studies and against scientists themselves, misleading literature, exploitation of scientific literature, and the list goes on and on. Carefully drafting the mandate of the new science policy panel gives us a chance to do things differently. In the paper we are presenting today, we argue that the science policy panel on chemicals waste and pollution prevention that is compliant with the right to science, that is credible and unbiased, and fit to inform decision-making must include minimum the following elements: a clear commitment to respect and protect human rights, a conflict of interest policy that protects the right to science, transparency and the right to access to information in environmental matters, the right to participation in environmental matters, an enabling and safe space for scientific inquiry, which requires a mechanism to prevent and address intimidation and reprisals against anyone engaging with the work of the panel. And finally, international cooperation, including through capacity building. We have a stellar group of panelists gathered here today who will delve into the different aspects of these elements. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Marcos Orellana, the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. Marcos, in 2021, you presented a report on the right to science in the context of toxic substances. How should the new science policy panel uphold the right to science, and what could be the consequences if it fails to do so? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ana Paula. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Marcos Orellana. I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, and I would first wish to thank the Geneva Environment Network and also the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for convening this conversation. Also welcome its information note and the elements in it. To your question, I wish to make 3 points. One is that conflict of interest would discredit the work of the science policy platform, and so they definitely need to be avoided. As you mentioned, Ana Paula, in 2021, I presented a thematic report on the right to science in context of hazardous substances to the Human Rights Council that recommended the establishment of an independent global platform for science policy interface on chemicals and wastes that is free from conflict of interest. This is explicitly built in the recommendation. Now, this recommendation builds on a UNEP report from 2020 that assessed options in this direction, as had been requested by the UN Environment Assembly in 2019 Resolution 48. In elaborating on this, I think it could be useful to think about a typology of scientists. And so we see scientists working in academia, also in industry, and what have in other forums called mercenary scientists. Now, the latter definitely need to be excluded because they work in product defense firms that derive a profit from spreading disinformation. And so this is not only a direct assault on the right to science, but certainly would discredit the work of the SPP. As to the participation of industry scientists, so that scientists that work in a corporation, in a chemical corporation, for example, we've seen several arguments. We've seen, for example, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel since there's practice in other forums. Others say we can't have a cookie cutter approach because the panel needs to be tailored to the specificities of the chemical and wastes sector. And what are those specificities? Well, the argument is that much of the information lies with industry, and so industry scientists are relevant to the process. Now, in response to that, we've also heard that even if this is true, industry scientists are not the owners of the information that would lie with industry, and so they're not entitled to disclose it. Now, needless to say, information on hazards and risks associated with chemicals should be in the public domain. And so here, this whole line of argumentation points to a serious gap in the frameworks that govern this space. What's relevant in regards to this question is also whether the platform will involve in assessments or data generation. And that distinction is, I think, also going to play out. In regards to conflict of interest, there's also the question of conflict avoidance, conflict management, disclosures, and leading to exclusion of scientists that may be conflicted, actual or potential conflicts. Now, conflict management, as based in disclosures, can have significant transaction costs. So who would check? Who has the time? And so having a dedicated body tasked with examining disclosures, if that's the approach that's taken, would reduce those transaction costs, but it also would go a long way in ensuring the integrity of the SVP. So that's a first point. The second point is that I wish to elaborate is on standards for scientific works. I don't know that the SPP will get into this, but perhaps guidance could be useful. And this is because a number of indigenous peoples around the world have elaborated, for example, protocols for equitable and ethical engagement. The protocols elaborated by the Inuit in the Arctic come to mind. They emphasize building relationships and trust, understanding Inuit knowledge and values. But it's not only about indigenous people's knowledge systems. It's also maybe local communities and what some people have termed extractive scientists or extractive science, where scientists will go into a community, extract knowledge, and then leave. And the argument is that often heard is that because the research is in the community's interest, there's an expectation of engagement. At the same time, communities often argue that it's time spent away from work or spent away from family, it's resources, income foregone, maybe, possibly. And so the recommendation of funding proposals, including budgets, that compensate communities for their time. This is even setting aside for a moment the ethical question of what to do with the findings. If the findings of assessments in a particular location reveal risk and responses lie outside the competence of those conducting the research, what to do about how to communicate those risks to the population, that's a very big question. So that's a second point on standards for scientific works. And the third and last is a question that arose in the briefing that the Geneva Environment Network and others organized last week on SPP, which relates to the interface with other forms of or other sources of knowledge. Indigenous peoples have often claimed that they are the first scientists and they should not be excluded from scientific assessments. And so how would the SPP engage indigenous systems of knowledge? In the briefing, I mentioned youth group talked about, and I quote, the experts of lived experience, end of quote. I think that's a great phrase. Over the last 2 days, by way of anecdote, I was in the National PFAS conference that's organized in the United States every 2 years. And I mentioned this because it's a conference that brings together scientists and representatives of, as they say, poisoned communities or contaminated communities, all in the same room, all sharing the same vocabulary and interfacing. This is not exactly what the right to science also requires in terms of public participation in decision making, where the plurality of voices that come together in shaping policy need to be safeguarded. It's more in the SPP's effectiveness. And could there be, for policy relevant scientific assessments, so for the effectiveness of that, and so could the design of the SPP contemplate a space for dialogue, a structured space for dialogue between scientists and indigenous peoples and contaminated communities, a working group perhaps? So this could go into discharging the principles of inclusion and participation. So to conclude, there has been significant progress to date on these questions, and I'm very much looking forward to SVP 3 in Geneva next week, tackling what's remaining. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marcos. We always learn so much from your expertise, from your contributions. Thank you for taking the time to be with here today. So just trying to summarize all the richness of your presentation. Thank you for highlighting that conflict of interest would describe the work of the panel and the importance of access to information that needs to be in the public domain to inform decision making, the importance of having a dedicated body to manage conflict of interest. You also spoke about standards for scientific work and the role of indigenous people's knowledge systems and local knowledge to inform the work of the panel. And an expression that I think I'm going to start using a lot, the inclusion of experts of living experiences. I hope I have done justice, summarizing what you've just presented. And this ties well with our next speaker, Kritika Canijo, who is a technical legal officer at the Public Health Law and Policies team in the World Health Organization. Kritika, from a health perspective, what is needed to ensure the integrity of the new panel? And are there any processes at the WHO that could inform the current negotiations? Over to you.
Thanks, Ana Paula, for that, for the question, for the invitation to join this panel. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. Well, integrity safeguards the quality of research and builds trust in the scientific community. And WHO as the directing and coordinating authority on health takes conflicts of interest very seriously. And we're pleased to see that the open-ended working group is addressing this for the science policy panel ahead of its establishment. So WHO's technical leadership in health requires it to shape the global health agenda, set global norms and standards, articulate evidence-based policy options, and provide technical support to countries. All of these functions are based on the collection of data and on the reliance of the best available science. So unbiased decision-making is crucial when giving guidance, for example, on the use of non-sugar sweeteners or the recommended levels of fruits and vegetables for children and adults. And as you rightly pointed out in your introduction, in the health context, we've observed the interference of commercial and vested interests. Take the tobacco industry, for example, which operated for years with the express intention of subverting the role of governments and of WHO in implementing public health policies to combat the tobacco epidemic. Thus, during the negotiation of WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, member states included a provision to commit to protect tobacco control policies from commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry. And WHO has a clear policy of not engaging with the tobacco industry. So one may ask, how does WHO deal with conflicts of interest? And given the nature of the work to be undertaken by the panel, I have the slide which includes a definition from WHO's Handbook for Guideline Development and one from WHO's Disclosure on Interest Form. And the idea of conflict of interest over here, as you can see, is set out very broadly. It's a set of circumstances that creates a risk or any interest rather than a specific type of interest. And it's also an important point that undue influence by the secondary interest is the relevant consideration here. So it's beyond direct personal gain, but actually the capacity to be unduly influenced in a way that impacts the primary purpose. If you could move to the next slide, please. I have a couple of key points from WHO's Guideline Development Handbook, which is, any external contributors to guideline development run by WHO have to provide a disclosure on interest form, which is a standardized form. And, you also need to submit your CV so their employment history is clear. And the assessment of those documents is by different people, depending on what sort of process they're looking at, but generally by the Secretariat or the Steering Committee to determine if there's a conflict of interest. And then the conflict is assessed for its severity and how that conflict is to be managed. And that management can take various forms. For example, if a conflict exists, then the expert should recuse itself from the discussions that are related to that area. Or if the conflict cannot be managed, that expert should not be involved in the guideline process at all. In terms of ensuring the scientific rigor and trustworthiness of a guideline, and to ensure that it is readily taken up by member states, it's important that a committee under the SPP has powers for the management of these conflicts. Also, an ongoing declaration of interests and strategies is what is required under the guideline development handbook. Now, the products that are published, be it guidelines or whatever that document is, in that the interests are disclosed and the manner in which they're managed. Just finally on the last slide and very quickly, so for the advancement of global health, WHO also engages with a wide variety of non-state actors, a term which is broadly defined to include non-governmental institutions, private sector, and academic institutions. And we then have a framework on engagement with these non-state actors, which also includes a section on conflicts of interest and how that should be dealt with. So in closing, these are some of the processes that we have at WHO, which could inform the discussions at the SPP. And I'll stop there, Annapaula, and hand it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kritika, and for highlighting that how it's important to ensure the integrity of science and how this builds trust. Not only that, but also integrity of science safeguards the quality of the scientific outputs. So decision making can be informed based on data and not masked by vested interest. Thank you also for linking with other processes such as the sweeteners, tobacco, and for walking us through the WHO Guidelines Development Handbook. I hope it can serve as an example for the states they still not so sure how to go about a conflict of interest policy for the new panel. And I think your presentation ties very well with our next speaker, Therese Carlson. She's the Science and Technical Advisor at IPEN, the International Pollutant Elimination Network. Therese, a pleasure to have you here today. And the question for you is, what are the guarantees that must be in place to ensure that the new panel is transparent and free from conflict of interest? In particular, how should the panel deal with information deemed commercially sensitive? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Annapaula. I want to start by thanking the co-organizers and speakers, and also to extend a special thank to the Geneva Environment Network for your work in these negotiations. During the negotiations next week, the OEWG will discuss transparency, conflicts of interest, participation, and operating principles, among other things. So next week will really be a key moment to ensure that there are safeguards to protect the integrity of the future panel. To do so, we at IPEM believe that it is important that the OEWG agrees that that the operating principles should include principles of precaution, prevention, and the protection of human rights, as well as transparency of both work and decision-making processes. We also believe it's important that the panel is inclusive and participatory, and that there's an implementation of robust conflict of interest policies. As noted in the information note just published by the Office of the High Commissioner, the credibility and effectiveness of the future panel will be compromised if there are any conflicts of interest or even the perception of such conflicts. Regarding transparency, I want to specifically draw your attention to a new draft procedure that will be discussed by the OEWG on safeguarding commercially sensitive information. And I want to highlight that the protection of business interests has been a driving force in creating the consequences that we're seeing today, where we have over 350,000 chemicals on the market, of which less than 1% has been adequately assessed for safety. And any procedures to safeguard commercially sensitive information would be highly unsuitable for a science policy panel for several reasons. First of all, there's no definition of what commercially sensitive information is. Scientists that have looked at this term note that a potentially limitless amount of information could fall within that term. Second, other science policy panels such as IPBES and IPCC do not have these types of procedures. They instead highlight the importance of ensuring that the data used in the work of those panels should be made publicly available. Third, it would harm the credibility of the panel, especially since the panel may then need to publish outputs without providing the full justification of its contents and its results. In order to provide policy-relevant outputs in a credible and transparent manner, it is crucial that there's full transparency about data and sources used to derive the outputs. Without the ability to access or assess the sources and data and information used, outputs of the panel are not likely to be seen as credible. So given that this procedure would undermine the purpose, transparency, and the credibility of the panel, and that other science policy panels do not have this type of procedure, we would therefore recommend for the upcoming negotiations that the OEWG delete the draft procedure and replace it with a statement that information on health and safety for humans and the environment cannot be considered as confidential. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Therese, for being short and for being going straight to the point. Thank you for highlighting also the principles that should guide the work of the new panel. And here you mentioned, you talked about precaution, prevention, transparency of work and decision making, inclusiveness, and the respect and protection of human rights. And then you brought a very important point on safeguarding commercially sensitive information, noting that over 350,000 chemicals in the market with less than 1% assessed for safety. I hope this, which I think is shocking figures, it stays with in the mind of everyone accompanying this meeting today. And then you also highlight that any protection of commercially sensitive information would not be useful for the work of the panel because there is no definition. Second, other science policy panels do not have such types of procedures, and actually they focus on information being publicly available, and how this would also harm the credibility of the SPP. The recommendation that you made in terms of that information that has related to health and safety with impacts for human and the planet should not be deemed confidential. This is a recommendation that we are also very much supporting and hoping that this will permeate the negotiations next week. So our next speaker is Martin Wagner, who is a professor of the Department of Biology of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Martin, we would be interested to hear some insights into how manufacturing doubt and attacks on scientists work. And also, we would like to know how the new Science Policy Panel should address those issues. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anna Paula, and thanks really for the invitation to yet another exciting panel hosted by the Geneva Environment Network. Let me start by congratulating the Office of the High Commissioner on the information note that's been presented today for the upcoming meeting of the open-ended working group on the Science Policy Panel. The note really highlights that the scientific work of the panel must be shielded from the influence of vested interest, building on strong conflict of interest rules, publicly available scientific information, as well as the participation of scientists, rights and knowledge holders, as well, and that's important, affected communities. You know, I just want to share in my intervention a bit of the lived experience as an academic scientist, and I want to really speak to attacks on science and scientists in general, focusing a bit on the broader issue problem of manufacturing doubt. You might know, but manufacturing doubt is a strategy that's deployed by businesses to create the appearance of scientific uncertainty on environmental and health issues caused by their operations. The idea is really simple as it is effective. As long as policymakers, decision makers believe that the science is not clear, they will not take action and the business can continue as usual. The strategy has been deployed first by big tobacco and since has been used to successfully delay action to mitigate the impacts of asbestos, as Anna Paula mentioned, of lead, pesticides, PFASs, chemicals and plastic, just to name a few. In general, corporations will use their own resources, their own experts, lobbyists, and hired consultants to criticize scientific studies that demonstrate harmful effects on their products, to publish misinformation on the science, often cherry-picking the science that supports their interests, to produce their own research designed to generate favorable outcomes, and that is often backed by the massive resources they have at hand that academic scientists really do not. And also by funding academic research workshops, academic societies to align them with their broader messaging and to control which research questions are being addressed by the scientific community, a problem that I call domesticating the scientific community. And then later on to use these so-called aligned scientists to create more scientific debate. So all of these activities are usually disguised as scientific critique or scientific research, mostly without mentioning the apparent conflicts of interest. But one aspect that is often really overlooked in the manufacture in doubt is that it often involves attacks on scientists themselves that aim at intimidating us, such as discrediting scientists publicly on social media, something we see on LinkedIn happening quite often now, or more clandestinely in scientific networks. Defaming scientists with their superiors, for instance, often targeting university presidents and rectors. Threatening scientists with legal action for the supposed financial damage that is caused by our science. And direct threats such as verbal assaults, aggressive emails, aggressive messages, and there's even more extreme cases. You might want to read up on the interesting story of Tyron Hayes, a scientist that worked on pesticides. Let me be clear, these incidences are widespread in the scientific community, and they especially target early career researchers and women. And these incidences have real-world consequences for our careers, our mental health, and importantly, on the science that we do. So what will happen if a science policy panel is not shielded from such attacks and from vested interest in general? The risk is that it will become yet another arena for manufacturing doubt that will result in a loss of its credibility, a production of weak scientific outputs that are not useful for policymakers, a delay in addressing the triple planetary crisis, and a further erosion in the public trust in science. So clearly there's a lot at stake here. What can be done to avoid such outcomes? Strong conflicts of interest policies must be implemented and enforced by the panel. So just declaring interests is not sufficient. Declarations must be checked and made publicly available to allow for scrutiny. And experts with established conflicts of interest must be excluded from the scientific work of the panel. The agenda setting and the scientific work of the panel must be conducted, in my opinion, without involving parties with vested interests. This does not prevent an exchange of information or views, which could happen in hearings or on stakeholder panels. And importantly, attempts to manufacture doubt and attacks on scientists should be reported to the panel, assessed, made public, and be mitigated. Let me close by saying that the practice of manufacturing doubt has created an atmosphere of distrust between scientists and the involved industries. I think the private sector should really work hard to rebuild that lost trust, for instance, by publicly pledging to stop manufacturing doubt on the science. Just if we get such a new trust, we can work jointly towards a non-toxic future for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. I hope you are enjoying this, the interventions as much as I am. I love learning and learning more. And with Martin, he never fails to deliver. Martin spoke about how manufacturing doubt has been used as a tactic. Basically, it makes policymakers believe that science is not clear, and as long as this is accepted as true, they will not take action and business will continue as usual. He also refers to attacks against scientists aiming at discredit them through defamations, smearing campaigns, legal action, aggressive behavior, with severe impacts on their mental health as well. And then, unfortunately, these incidents are widespread, but also they especially target women and new scientists. And then Martinez called for the SPP not to be another arena to manufacture doubt, delaying addressing the multiple planetary crises, and stirring doubt in the public about science. He finished with not only referring to how the science policy panel should have a mechanism to address reprisals against scientists and anyone engaging in the work of the panel. That is also a call that we have been making as HHR, and we hope that from next week we'll hear this call and include this recommendation part in the text that is being finalized next week, but also a pledge for business to stop manufacturing doubt, and in doing so, rebuild the trust with independent scientists. So thank you very much, Martin, for sharing those points with us. To bring us to our next speaker, that's Frankie Orona. He's the Executive Director of the Society of Native Nations. Frankie, what a pleasure to have you in this panel. We have been trying to get you in one of the panels for a long time, so happy to have you here. And we'd like to know from you why it is crucial for the mandate of the new Science Policy Panel to respect and protect indigenous knowledge and systems on par with other types of science, and how could indigenous knowledge contribute to the work of the panel? Over to you.
Thank you, Haku. First of all, thank you all for this shared information and participation. My name is Frankie, and my families are Tangwa and Chumash. I'm also the liaison for my tribal chief, Anthony Morales, of the Tangwa Gabalino peoples. And I'm also with the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. I'm here in Oaxaca. My internet connection is not well, and I've been up since 4 a.m., so I apologize. I'm here attending the GO7 Indigenous Knowledge and Local Knowledge Dialogues. I'm going to start with the fact that Indigenous knowledge is science. Trial and error with historical records makes founded science. This is our oral traditions and the passing of this information from generation to generation. These issues we face with chemicals and management in our communities are human rights violations. It is a crisis and has been for generations. I appreciate our colleagues and the participation that helps to bring Indigenous people into these spaces where we can address the impacts in our communities that essentially impact the world and all those that we share life with, right? And so chemicals and management of these very toxins that have been killing our environment, our lands, territories, and people for generations, where there is conflict of interest and the resolve of these issues, as Marcos mentioned earlier in his presentation, needs more attention in these processes for equitable participation, and is where capacity building is needed. Many Indigenous people also believe there must be protection, security, and safeguards for Indigenous people and their communities, and especially for all Indigenous knowledge shared. Many here at the GO7 now, at these dialogues, believe that we cannot protect Indigenous knowledge in these global spaces because of the historical abuse, extraction, and misuse of Indigenous people and their knowledge. So as we can, in our own communities, we know how we understand the sacredness and the importance of protecting that knowledge in our own communities. These are issues that need attention, and that we can work to have more participation in the SPP. We need more Indigenous people as experts from multiple regions to participate because of the differences in culture and perspectives to addressing the lived experiences and impacts for generations of our communities. And I think that, as long as we can continue to realize that we're not separate from our environment, we're one and the same, and in order to ensure that all future generations have a healthy, sustainable future to look forward to, we need to make sure that our environment and the impacts that we have on our very environment is our responsibility to help keep in balance. And we have been out of balance for quite some time, and we continue to come up with so many of these false solutions to addressing these issues we face in our communities. And if we are truly to make a difference in time for our children and our children's children, then we must look at the root of the causes that are bringing these harms, and looking and being able to self-reflect on ourselves as human beings, and with the understanding of that coexistence. We mentioned here at the GO7 how, as an example of understanding, is that elders have stated that we're like those that live in a fishbowl that share the same water, the same air. They live within their own circular existence of how we share the same water our children have, and our children will share, the same after we are no longer here. And this continued cycle of everything, life and death, that continues to give energy to this world and to all existence. And they would ask you, if we live in this fishbowl all together, how dirty do you want that fishbowl to be? How dirty of the water in that fishbowl do you feel comfortable living in? And so we need to understand that we have a responsibility to keep that fishbowl as clean as possible, so that we don't just survive, but we can thrive within those environments that we live in and coexist with. And we also need to understand that with that responsibility, that it is our responsibility to keep things in balance. And I think this is where our Indigenous knowledge that has been passed down from generation to generation can help in these perspectives and understanding of that coexistence, for that healthy environment that we all need in order to sustain ourselves in a good and healthy way. So I am excited to participate as much as I can. I think that more of our people that are experts, because of the knowledge keepers that they've been designated to be for our communities, need more space and participation in these processes to understand and to help this modern science to become truly founded in the approaches that we're trying to address, and always to ensure that there is safeguards to re-encourage our wisdom keepers and elders of our communities to re-engage and stay engaged in these processes and to share that knowledge, because they have reserved themselves in many ways because of that historical abuse and misuse. And so let's work on reestablishing that trust, so that we can all participate on making a better future for all future generations, for all communities, for all regions, and for all living things that we coexist with. So thank you, Haku. I appreciate the time and the space. Haku, thank you.
Cool, Frankie. Thank you very much for starting from the outset, referring that indigenous people's knowledge is science. And that the issues faced with chemicals and waste in indigenous communities are human rights violations. They are killing people and poisoning their lands, territories, and resources. And the importance of having indigenous peoples from all the 7 indigenous social cultural regions to be allowed to participate, but we are not talking any of participation, we are talking about meaningful and active participation in the work of the panel. And then the indigenous people's role to helping the planet keep in balance. And instead, the planet is very unbalanced and with false solutions propagating. And I think you went more into philosophical road at the end, questioning us on how we need to look at the root causes of where we stand today, where the planet is today, and self-reflect on what coexistence truly means. Thank you very much for your words, Frankie. Which, before introducing our next speakers, I just want to do some time management. And the blame can always be on the moderator. And I know it's just like the interventions have been so great that I wouldn't dare stopping anyone. But we do have very limited time and 3 other speakers. We may just flagging for those of you following the panel, we may stay for another 5 or 10 minutes if needed. I'm sure that the next 3 speakers have also a lot to share and would like to give everybody the chance to present. So our next speaker is Olga Iskaredina. She's the Science Policy Thematic Facilitator from the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP. Olga, throughout the negotiations, the Children and Youth Major Group has been raising the need for the panel to include the views of children and youth, and the importance of its work to be guided by human rights and intergenerational equity. Could you develop more on those proposals?
Sure. Thank you, Ana Paula, for giving me the floor, for the invitation, and for also acknowledging the efforts of the Children and Youth Major Group in promoting intergenerational equity and advocating for the inclusion of the children and youth in the work of the panel. So here I would like to highlight a few key points. First of all, none of the existing science policy panels currently recognize intergenerational equity as an operating principle. What we propose is both innovative and necessary. The issues of chemicals, waste, and pollution we confront today have enduring impacts on future generations, as was mentioned by many of the speakers today. By embedding intergenerational equity into the panel's operating principles, we ensure that our assessments and policy recommendations are not only viable in the short term, but also beneficial over the decades, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this also goes hand in hand with what Frankie just outlined a few minutes ago about intergenerational responsibility. And this also works closely with recognizing the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. A human rights-based approach to managing chemicals, waste, and pollution should include respecting and integrating the knowledge and practices of indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as addressing and mitigating intersectional vulnerabilities that communities face due to health, conflict, and other factors. If we move forward to the next slide, young people are critical stakeholders who bring unique knowledge, skills, and lived experiences, as have been already mentioned today. And their contributions can significantly enhance the policy design, implementation, and evaluation. With CYMG, we did the research on youth engagement in existing science policy interfaces. And we can recognize that many of the science policy panels, they already have established practices. For example, youth workshops and fellowship programs through which they engage with young people and early career researchers. However, these existing mechanisms, they do not fully capture the breadth of the expertise that young people can contribute and bring to these spaces. That is why, to address this gap, as CYMG, we propose the creation of a youth expert advisory group as a subcommittee of the interdisciplinary expert committee. This group would integrate the voices of youth experts and early career professionals into the panel's work, facilitate engagement and outreach with youth communities, as well as ensure that the panel's outcomes are inclusive, forward-looking, and sustainable. This group should be representative across all regions and genders, with a particular focus on including voices from vulnerable and marginalized communities. And my last point is that we advocate for the stakeholder engagement strategy for the new panel to be developed through an open and public consultation process that actively involves all stakeholders, including young people as equal partners. And through this approach, we can help the panel to understand and address the specific needs and expertise of young people while also fostering their trust, ownership, and commitment as key stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Olga, and thank you for being concise as well. Well, you referred to intergenerational equity, basically justified by how decisions of today should not compromise the rights of future generations to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And I also hope that states are taking note of the proposal for a youth expert advisory group. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you next week as well at the negotiations. Our next speaker is Chinky Pelinho-Gole. She's from the Eco Waste Coalition, but also the Southeast and East Asia Regional Coordinator for IPAN. Chinky, IPAN is an organization that engages in citizen science. I would like to know from you, why is there a need for civil society organizations to participate in all of the work of the SPP? And also, how can civil society organizations and citizen science contribute to the work of the panel? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ana Paula. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So to answer the questions, please allow me to share my experiences in working with the CSOs and also my reflections. So before joining the Eco Waste Coalition and IPAN as regional coordinator for Southeast and East Asia, I work with local and national environmental non-government organizations in the Philippines. In my previous work, I assist NGOs in community and campaign organizing, environmental policy advocacy, capacity building, and partnering with local experts and academic institutions to support our advocacy work. I am exposed to several environmental and social issues experienced by local communities that are vulnerable or impacted by various development interventions like mining, coal-fired power plants, monocrop plantations, urban and waste pollution, and so on. And we help local communities raise their issues and concerns with the policy and decision makers so they are appropriately addressed. We train community members to become citizen scientists and help provide information and studies when advocating for policy legislation and implementation to address environmental issues and concerns. And we appreciate the importance of scientific studies as they become excellent references in developing and implementing policies. And even with the enacted environmental policies, we continue to work with citizen scientists and local and national experts to generate and utilize data and information to assess implementation of policies. And as NGOs, we also apply for accreditation in the local and national policy or special bodies, policy making, decision making bodies. And we are often called the watchdogs because we closely monitor every stage of policy development, enactment, and implementation, provide critical insights, and ensure that decision-making processes are done appropriately and communicated properly to the general public, particularly the local communities. And I think one of the local NGOs that I work with and the one I'm currently working with are participating organizations of IPEN, and together with more than 600 NGOs in 129 countries, IPEN POs are doing similar work, working with local and national organizations and experts and bringing their great work and initiatives to the global level while contributing to solving environmental and social issues on the ground. So what are the biggest lessons and reflections from working with these NGOs? What are my reflections? So first, our roles vary from being community responders, researchers, educators, experts, negotiators, collaborators, and even co-implementers. We're conscience guardians and watchdogs. We want to ensure that every stage of policymaking and implementing processes is carefully done and that proper information is provided to stakeholders, especially the impacted communities. We ensure that voices and realities from the ground are heard while we demand appropriate actions from the duty bearers. We play an important role as legislators in global environmental governance by proposing new policies and based on studies and influencing national policies by providing policy recommendations, as well as establishing and disseminating international norms. We represent the public and environmental interests and act as bridges between the government and the public. We educate and co-power the public to participate in local, national, and international environmental governance. So what do these things have to do with the work of the Science Policy Panel? So CSOs, including local experts and citizen scientists' participation in the SPP will provide relevant knowledge and information based on scientific studies, ground realities, and actual experiences in working with the vulnerable and impacted sectors, populations, communities, organizations, or countries. Our participation in the panel will make it credible as we seriously continue our role of being watchdogs and conscience guardians. We would like to contribute because we can, we have the knowledge and expertise, and we will ensure that conflict of interest has no place nor will influence the work of the SPP while ensuring transparency and credibility are adhered to in all the work of the SPP. And because we seriously want to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent local, national, and global pollution. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jinky. First, to remind us that how diverse civil society is. So you refer to civil society as community responders, experts, scientists, educators, and above all, guardians and watchdogs. And how is this diversity that improves and informs decision making, and why you should have the right to meaningful, actively, and safely participate in the work of the Science Policy Panel. Thank you very much, Chinky. Our last speakers, but not least, last but not least, speakers is Rachel Radvani. She's the environmental health campaigner from the Center for International Environmental Law. Rachel, what would be your recommendations on how the new panel should ensure its work is inclusive, participatory, and free from conflict of interest? And as last speaker, you have also the chance to wrap up based on all the interventions that came before you. So over to you.
Thank you, Ana Paula, and thank you to the Geneva Environment Network and the other co-organizers of today's webinar, and also to the other speakers. I'm glad to be the last speaker because a lot of our recommendations from CL are very much aligned with what the previous speakers have touched on. So I'll try and tie some of this together, especially as we are running short on time. So to the first part of the question, ensuring inclusive participation in the panel means creating space for observers in the subsidiary bodies, in particular in the interdisciplinary expert committee of the science policy panel, as well as in the decision-making processes and the decision-making body. It means inviting submissions from observers to contribute to the panel's work program, and it means being transparent about all processes, including decision-making processes. So in particular, as Marcos, Frankie, and Chinky spoke about, Indigenous knowledge systems and citizen science should be integrated into the work of the panel, along with the experts themselves being involved. It's very good to see that there is text currently in the proposals for the SVP that safeguards observer participation from Indigenous peoples, and inputs from local scientists, and this should definitely be maintained throughout OEWG3 to set up the panel. And at the same time, we also need to strengthen the current proposed conflict of interest policy to ensure that it truly protects against undue vested interests. So as Ana Paula, Kritika, and Martin referenced, industry influence has been extremely well documented across the board, and this influence would undermine the credibility and legitimacy of this panel. And so specifically, the conflict of interest policy should be applicable to all experts and partnerships engaging in the work of the panel. It should apply to both current and previous engagements, as well as all interests that could cause a conflict, both real and potential. And so all of this needs to work both ways. For it to work at the SVP level, there's also a need for this change where the science is actually being done, as well as where science and policy interact at the national level. These international assessments and products will be immensely helpful, but there's also a need for action on the national and local level to protect people from the impacts of chemicals, waste, and pollution. And so I would just say this is something we're talking about in the context of the SVP today, but it's part of a wider conversation across a lot of different spaces. How do we ensure the right to participation and protect against conflicts of interest in matters relating to the environment and human health? And to get there, we have to be innovative. The situation that we're in right now with the triple planetary crisis is the result of very strong influence from corporate interests and very little consideration of participation of civil society, rights holders across environmental spaces for years. So something needs to change, and the Science Policy Panel is a great opportunity to get this right. And all of the speakers today have proposed very specific recommendations for how to do so. And I would add that these are not controversial recommendations. These are things that the research is telling us that we need to do to ensure that we make progress on issues like chemicals, waste, and the prevention of pollution. And so meaningful participation from civil society, from Indigenous peoples, from youth, from citizen scientists will help the panel's outputs be higher quality and be more policy relevant and more widely accepted. And this will help build that political will, which is one of the biggest obstacles to meaningful progress on addressing chemicals and waste, along with other obstacles that other speakers touched on as well. And so this will ensure that the panel's outputs will spur progress on actually implementing policies that protect human health and the environment from chemicals, waste, and pollution. And I would just close by saying the costs of action are enormous. The longer we wait, the harder this will be as actors attempting to hold corporations to account and protect public health become increasingly captured by corporate interests, and we're seeing this across the board. And so human health and the environment will continue to be negatively impacted, impeding the rights of both current and future generations to enjoy the fulfillment of their human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for making my work in wrapping up so much easier, Rachel. So you refer to that inclusivity in participation means creating spaces for observers in the subsidiary bodies and also in the decision making of the panel. That needs to have more transparency of decision making. That the text there is already text that promotes participation, which should be maintained. However, the text under the conflict of interest policy needs to be strengthened. And then you mentioned several points, should include all interests, current and previous, actual and potential interests. And then action is also needed at the national level to protect people from the impacts of chemicals, waste, and pollution, and how the multiple planetary crisis is the result of conflict of interest, of vested interest, with little participation from civil society organizations and indigenous peoples, and that something needs to change. And then meaningful participation will help outputs be of higher quality and acceptable, and help building political will. And you ended by highlighting something we should all know, but perhaps we don't want to acknowledge, that the cost of inaction is enormous. And so just in closing, I would like to use a quote from Volker Turk, High Commissioner for Human Rights. And he said, and I'm very well open quotation marks, upholding human rights can ensure that environmental policy is driven by facts and evidence, and not denialism, greed, and profit. And with this, I would close the meeting, thanking all the wonderful speakers for their contribution. Thank you all of those who have followed the meeting in any time zone that you are. Thank you very much. And Diana, I'm not sure if you like to have some final words before we officially close the meeting. Over to you.
Just to mention that we all look forward to see you, for those who are not in Geneva, to see you in Geneva next week or in the coming days. And also the following week, where we will have the Basel Convention open-ended working group, where we will be active with some of the stakeholders that have joined us today on the panel with the various side events related also to this important topic. Thank you, Ana Paula.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice continuation of your day. Bye.